Lily Dawson was 17 years old, 5 months pregnant, and living 12 feet beneath the earth in a root cellar that hadn't been opened in 40 years. Above her head, she could hear her stepfather's boots crossing the kitchen floor every morning at 6:15, every evening at 7:30. The rhythm of his footsteps marking time, like the pendulum of a clock she could no longer see. She had been down there for 19 weeks when the trapdoor creaked open for the first time since she'd pulled it shut behind her, and the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, and a voice she didn't recognize said her name. She expected to be dragged up into the light and beaten until she miscarried, the way he'd promised he would if she didn't get rid of it herself. What she didn't expect was the face of an 83-year-old woman she'd never met, kneeling at the edge of the hole, extending a hand that was more wrinkle than skin, and saying 4 words that split Lily's world in half. "I know you're there." To understand how a girl ends up buried alive on her own family's property, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the pregnancy, or the beginning of the abuse, but the beginning of Lily herself, a child born in the back bedroom of a farmhouse in Harlan County, Kentucky, on the coldest night of February 1987. To a mother who was 19 years old and a father who was already dying of the same black lung that had taken his father and his grandfather before him. The house was a 2-story white clapboard structure set back from a gravel road that didn't have a name, only a number, Rural Route 7, and the nearest neighbor lived 2 miles up the hollow in a trailer that listed to one side, like a ship taking on water. The land around the house was dense with poplar and oak, with a creek running along the western property line that swelled to a roar every spring and shrank to a whisper by August. This was Lily's world for the first 8 years of her life. The house, the trees, the creek, her mother's hands kneading bread dough in the mornings, and her father's cough echoing through the thin walls at night. She didn't know they were poor, because everyone she knew was poor. She didn't know her father was sick because he never stopped working, hauling himself out of bed every morning to tend the small garden that kept them fed, to patch the roof that kept them dry, to hold her mother in the evenings, while Lily pretended to be asleep on the other side of the room. The house had 2 bedrooms, but one of them had belonged to her grandmother before she passed, and her mother couldn't bring herself to clear it out, so Lily slept on a cot pushed against the wall of her parents' room, a quilt pulled up to her chin, listening to the sounds of their breathing until she drifted off. Her father died on a Tuesday in March, 11 days after her 8th birthday. The cough that had been his constant companion for as long as Lily could remember turned into something else, a wet, drowning sound that filled the house like water filling a sinking ship. Her mother sent her to stay with a woman from the church, a thin-lipped woman named Mrs. Barker, who smelled like mothballs and cooked everything in bacon grease. And when Lily came home 3 days later, her father's side of the bed was empty, and the quilt her grandmother had made, the one with the pattern of interlocking circles in blue and white and yellow, was folded at the foot of her cot like a gift he'd left behind. Her mother didn't cry, or if she did, she didn't let Lily see it. She moved through the days like a woman walking underwater, her gestures slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on something Lily couldn't see. The garden went untended that spring. The roof began to leak. The church ladies brought casseroles and condolences, but by summer, even they had stopped coming, and Lily and her mother were alone in a way that felt permanent, the kind of alone that settles into your bones and doesn't leave. For 4 years, they managed. Her mother took in laundry from the families who could afford it, scrubbing sheets and shirts on a washboard in the backyard, hanging them to dry on a line strung between 2 oaks. Lily learned to cook, not well, but enough to keep them from starving. She learned to mend clothes, to stretch a bag of flour into 2 weeks of meals, to read by candlelight when they couldn't afford the electric bill. She walked 3 miles each way to the school in the valley, a brick building with cracked windows and teachers who looked at her with pity she didn't understand and didn't want. She was not an exceptional student, but she was not a failing one either. She existed in the middle, unnoticed, unremarkable, a girl whose clothes were always clean but never new, whose homework was always done but never praised. The other children didn't bully her, but they didn't befriend her either. She was simply there, a fixture of the landscape, as unremarkable as the trees or the creek or the sky. The year Lily turned 12, her mother met Carl Weston at the hardware store in town. Lily wasn't there for the meeting, She was home, watching the pot of beans on the stove, making sure they didn't burn. But she heard about it later, in the breathless way her mother described the tall man with the blue eyes and the nice truck who'd helped her load a bag of fertilizer into the back of their rusted-out station wagon. He'd asked for her number. Her mother had given it, something she hadn't done since Lily's father died. He called that night, and the next night, and the night after that. By the end of the month, he was coming to dinner. By the end of the summer, he had moved in. By Christmas, they were married in the same church where Lily's father's funeral had been held, and Lily stood in a second-hand dress that was too big in the shoulders and too short in the hem, watching her mother say vows to a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Carl Weston was not a monster, not at first. He was something more common and more dangerous. A man who believed the world owed him something and had spent 42 years being disappointed. He'd grown up 2 counties over, the youngest of 4 brothers, the one who was never as strong, never as smart, never as loved. He'd worked oil fields and construction sites and auto body shops, never lasting more than a year in any one place, always leaving with a grudge and a grievance and the unshakable conviction that he'd been wronged. He drank, but not excessively, 2 or 3 beers a night, never enough to stumble, always enough to sharpen the edges of his voice. He wasn't violent, not at first. He was controlling in ways that seemed like concern. He wanted to know where Lily's mother was going, who she was seeing, when she'd be back. He didn't like her talking to the church ladies. He didn't like her taking phone calls in the other room. He didn't like the way the man at the gas station looked at her, so she stopped going to the gas station. He didn't like the way her cousin from Tennessee kept calling, so she stopped answering the phone. The world contracted around them, slowly, steadily, until the only orbit they moved in was the one Carl controlled. Lily watched it happen, the way you watch a flood rise. First the water is in the yard, and you tell yourself it's not so bad. Then it's on the porch, and you tell yourself it won't come inside. Then it's at your ankles, your knees, your waist, and by the time you realize you should have run, you're already drowning. She was 12 when Carl moved in. She was 13 when she realized her mother was afraid of him. She was 14 the first time she heard him hit her, a sound like a hand slapping a side of meat, followed by a silence that was somehow worse than screaming. She lay in her cot in the dark, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she made a decision that would shape the next 3 years of her life. She decided to become invisible. She stopped talking at dinner. She stopped meeting Carl's eyes. She stopped being in rooms where he was alone. She moved through the house like a ghost, silent and watchful, learning the rhythms of his moods the way animals learn the rhythms of a predator. She knew when he was building towards something, the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed on the table, the edge in his voice when he asked a question that wasn't really a question. And she knew how to disappear before the storm broke. She'd slip out the back door, into the woods, down to the creek, where the sound of the water drowned out everything else. She'd sit on the bank with her knees pulled up to her chest, watching the current carry leaves and sticks towards some destination she couldn't see, and she'd wait until the sky darkened, and she knew, somehow, instinctively, that it was safe to go back. But you can't be invisible forever. You can't shrink yourself small enough to disappear. Lily was 15 when Carl noticed her for the first time in a way that made her stomach turn to ice. She was coming out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around her, her hair dripping down her back, and he was standing in the hallway, blocking her path to her room. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just looked at her, a long, slow look that started at her feet and ended at her face, and smiled. It was the smile that scared her most. It wasn't leering or hungry. It was proprietary, the smile of a man looking at something he owned. She pushed past him without a word, locked herself in her room, and sat with her back against the door until her legs went numb. That night, she started sleeping with a kitchen knife under her pillow. She was 15 years old, and she had already learned that the people who were supposed to protect you were sometimes the ones you needed protection from. The next 2 years were a careful choreography of avoidance and survival. Carl never touched her, not the way she feared, but he found other ways to make her know he could. He'd brush past her in the hallway, his hand grazing her hip. He'd come into the bathroom while she was brushing her teeth, claiming he needed something from the cabinet. He'd make comments at dinner about her body, about the way she dressed, about the boys at school who must be sniffing around, and her mother would stare at her plate and say nothing. Her mother, who had once held Lily in the dark after her father died and promised that they would be okay, that they would always have each other. Her mother, who now flinched at loud noises and wore long sleeves in summer and had stopped looking Lily in the eye. There were moments when Lily hated her mother more than she hated Carl. Carl was a snake. But her mother had let the snake into the garden. The boy's name was Daniel. He was 17, a junior at the school in the valley, the son of a man who ran the only mechanic shop in town. He wasn't handsome, his ears stuck out, and his nose had been broken twice in fights he swore he hadn't started, but he was kind in a way that felt revolutionary to Lily, who had forgotten that kindness existed. He sat next to her in biology class, the only class they shared, and he noticed her. Not the way Carl noticed her, with possession and intent. He noticed her the way you notice a bird with a broken wing, with concern and a desire to help. He asked her questions about herself. He listened to the answers. He didn't try to touch her or impress her or make her into something she wasn't. He just saw her, the real her, the girl behind the invisibility she'd perfected. They started talking after class, then before class, then during lunch, sitting on the bleachers behind the gym, sharing a sandwich his mother had packed for him because she always packed too much. By spring of Lily's sophomore year, she was in love for the first time in her life, with a boy whose ears stuck out and whose hands were always stained with motor oil and who looked at her like she was something worth looking at. They were together for 3 months before anything happened. 3 months of holding hands in the hallways, of stolen kisses behind the gymnasium, of whispered conversations on a borrowed phone while Carl snored in the living room. Lily told Daniel everything, about her father, about Carl, about the fear that lived in her chest like a second heartbeat. He wanted to save her. He wanted to march into her house and confront Carl, to take her away to someplace safe. But there was no place safe, and they both knew it. She was 16. He was 17. They had no money, no car, no plan. All they had was each other, and for a while, that was enough. It happened on a night in late April, in the back of Daniel's father's pickup truck, parked in a clearing by the creek where Lily had spent so many hours alone. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a decision so much as a surrender to each other, to the moment, to the desperate need to feel something other than fear. Lily didn't know anything about protection, about consequences, about the ways your body could betray you. Her mother had never explained. The school had never taught. She only knew that for those 17 minutes in the bed of that truck, with the stars wheeling overhead and Daniel's breath warm against her neck, she felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. She felt safe. She felt held. She felt, for the first time since her father died, like she wasn't alone. Daniel's family moved to Ohio at the end of May. His father had gotten a job offer, better pay, better hours, a chance to get out of a town that had been dying for decades. Daniel begged to stay, to finish his senior year, to be near Lily. But he was 17, and his parents said no. And on a Thursday morning that Lily would remember for the rest of her life, she stood at the end of her gravel driveway and watched the U-Haul disappear around the bend in the road. He promised to write. He promised to call. He promised that as soon as he turned 18, he would come back for her, and they would leave together, and everything would be okay. Lily nodded and smiled and waved until she couldn't see the truck anymore, and then she walked into the woods and sat by the creek and cried until there was nothing left inside her. She missed her period in June. She told herself it was stress, the grief of losing Daniel, the constant tension of living under the same roof as Carl. She missed her period in July. She told herself the same things, louder this time, more insistently. By August, she couldn't tell herself anything anymore. Her breasts ached. Her stomach churned every morning. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and saw a body that was no longer entirely her own. She was 16 years old, she was pregnant, and she was utterly, completely alone. The test was a cheap one from the pharmacy in town, purchased with money she'd stolen from Carl's wallet while he slept, $4.73, enough for the test and nothing else. She took it in the bathroom at 5:30 in the morning before anyone else was awake, and she watched the second line appear like a sentence being handed down in a court of law. Positive. The word didn't fit the terror that flooded through her. There was nothing positive about this. There was only a fact, brutal and undeniable, growing inside her with each passing day. She thought about telling her mother, She imagined the conversation, the words, the tears, the desperate hope that her mother would rise to the occasion, would remember who she'd been before Carl, would protect her daughter the way she'd failed to protect herself. But every time Lily opened her mouth to speak, she saw her mother's face, the dullness in her eyes, the fear that lived there now like a permanent resident, and the words died in her throat. Her mother couldn't protect herself. How could she protect Lily? How could she protect a baby? She thought about telling Daniel. She knew his address in Ohio. He'd given it to her before he left, written in blue pen on a scrap of notebook paper she kept folded in the pocket of her jeans. She wrote him a letter. She told him everything. She sealed it in an envelope, wrote out the address, and walked halfway to the post office before turning around and walking home. She couldn't do it. She couldn't reach across 500 miles and drop this bomb on a boy who was just starting a new life, who had no money and no power and no ability to help her. She couldn't turn his promise to come back into an obligation he might resent. She loved him too much to trap him. So she burned the letter in the backyard, watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash, and told herself that someday, when things were different, she would find him again. The first time Carl noticed was in September, 3 weeks before her 17th birthday. She was standing in the kitchen, wearing one of her father's old flannel shirts, trying to hide the way her belly had begun to curve outward. And Carl looked up from his eggs and said, "You're getting fat." He said it casually, the way you'd comment on the weather, but his eyes were sharp, and Lily knew with a certainty that made her knees go weak, that he suspected. She forced herself to laugh. "Guess I've been eating too much," she said. But her hands were shaking as she poured herself a glass of water, and she saw his eyes drop to her midsection, and she saw the calculation there, and she knew that time was running out. The beating came 2 weeks later. It started over nothing, a plate she hadn't washed, a tone he didn't like. But it ended with Lily on the kitchen floor, her arms wrapped around her stomach, Carl standing over her with his fists clenched and his breath coming hard. "You think I don't know?" he said. "You think I'm stupid? You spread your legs for some boy and now you're knocked up and you think I'm going to feed another mouth in this house?" Lily's mother stood in the doorway, frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Carl crouched down, grabbed a handful of Lily's hair, and pulled her face close to his. He smelled like beer and cigarette smoke and something rotten underneath. "You're going to get rid of it," he said, "one way or another, and if you don't, I will." That night, while Carl snored in front of the television and her mother sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing, Lily made a decision. She wasn't going to run. She had nowhere to go, no money, no one to take her in. She wasn't going to fight. Carl was bigger, stronger, meaner, and he would win. She wasn't going to give up her baby. This baby, Daniel's baby, the only piece of him she had left. She was going to hide. Not in the woods where he would find her. Not in the barn where she would be exposed. She was going to hide somewhere he would never think to look. The root cellar had been dug by Lily's great-grandfather in 1923, back when the house was new and the land was worked by a family large enough to need a place to store the harvest through the long Kentucky winters. It was cut into the hillside behind the house, its entrance hidden by a wooden door that had been covered over by decades of fallen leaves and creeping vines. Lily had discovered it when she was 10, exploring the property in the aimless way children explore, and she had climbed down into the darkness with a flashlight she'd taken from the kitchen drawer and found a space approximately 12 feet by 10 feet, with earthen walls reinforced by rotting timber and a ceiling low enough that she'd had to stoop even at 10 years old. There were shelves along one wall, empty except for a few rusted mason jars. There was a dirt floor, hard-packed and dry. There was a smell of earth and age, and something faintly sweet, like apples that had been stored there long ago. She had never told anyone about it. It had been her secret, her hiding place, the one corner of the world that belonged entirely to her. Now, at 16 years old and 8 weeks pregnant, she returned to it. She waited until Carl left for his shift at the factory, 7:30 in the morning, regular as clockwork, and her mother retreated to her bedroom with a headache that Lily knew was really heartbreak, and then she moved. She packed a backpack with everything she could think of. Clothes, the warmest ones she owned. A blanket, not her grandmother's quilt, that would be too obvious, but a wool blanket from the closet that hadn't been used in years. Food, crackers, peanut butter, a jar of pickles, 3 cans of beans, a flashlight and every battery she could find, a jug of water, a knife, not for protection, but for opening cans. The letter she'd written to Daniel and never sent, retrieved from the ashes and reconstructed from memory, tucked into the pocket of her jeans where the original address had worn through. She took $47 from the jar where her mother kept household money, not all of it, just enough that it might not be noticed. She took a photograph of her father from the frame on the mantel, sliding it out and leaving the frame behind. And she took the quilt, after all, folded small and pressed against her chest, because she couldn't bear to leave it behind. The trapdoor to the cellar was heavier than she remembered, thick oak warped by decades of weather, and it took all her strength to pull it open. The smell that rose up was familiar, earth and age and apples, and something else too, something musty and closed in, the smell of air that hadn't moved in 40 years. She climbed down the ladder, her backpack dragging at her shoulders, and when her feet hit the dirt floor, she turned and looked up at the rectangle of gray October sky above her, and she realized that she was about to close herself inside the earth with no guarantee of when, or if, she would come out. She closed the trapdoor anyway. The first week was the hardest, not because of the physical discomfort, though there was plenty of that, but because of the silence. Lily had never experienced silence like this, silence so complete that she could hear her own blood pumping through her ears, could hear her heart beat like a drum, could hear the tiny sounds of her body existing in space. Above her, she could hear footsteps, Carl's boots in the morning and evening, her mother's lighter tread throughout the day, the creak of the floorboards, the slam of the screen door, the muffled voices of arguments she couldn't make out. She learned their rhythms. She learned when it was safe to move around and when she had to lie still, barely breathing, waiting for the footsteps to pass. She learned to eat in the dark, to use the corner of the cellar she designated as a bathroom, to wrap herself in the quilt and the blanket, and still shiver through the October nights that turned the earth around her to ice. The cellar was not meant for living. It was meant for storing potatoes and onions and canned goods, for keeping things cold and dry and safe from spoilage. The ceiling was low enough that she couldn't stand fully upright. The walls pressed in on her like the walls of a coffin, and some nights she woke gasping, convinced that the earth was collapsing, that she was being buried alive. But she stayed. She stayed because above her was a man who had promised to beat the baby out of her, and below her was a space where no one would think to look, and somewhere inside her was a life that depended on her staying alive. She rationed her food carefully, eating as little as she could while still keeping her strength up. She knew, with the grim practicality of a girl who had learned to survive, that her supplies wouldn't last forever. She knew that eventually she would have to leave the cellar, to find more food, to find water, to face whatever was waiting for her above. But for now, in those first weeks, she focused on the immediate, staying warm, staying quiet, staying alive. She talked to the baby. That was the only thing that kept her sane. She would lie in the darkness with her hands on her belly, feeling the subtle changes happening inside her, and she would whisper. She would tell the baby about her father, about the way he used to carry her on his shoulders through the garden. She would tell the baby about Daniel, about his crooked nose and his oil-stained hands, and the way he looked at her like she mattered. She would tell the baby about the world outside this hole in the ground, about trees and sunlight and the sound of the creek in springtime. And she would promise, over and over, that they would see it together, that she would keep them safe, that she would get them out. By November, the supplies were running low. Lily had stretched the food as far as she could, but there was only so much stretching you could do with 3 cans of beans and a jar of peanut butter. She started making trips above ground, brief, terrifying excursions in the dead of night when Carl was asleep and her mother was in her room and the house stood dark and silent against the sky. She would creep through the back door, moving by feel and memory, and take what she could from the kitchen without being noticed. A loaf of bread here, a package of cheese there, fruit from the bowl on the counter, cans from the pantry, a gallon jug of water refilled at the sink. She was a ghost in her own home, haunting the rooms she used to live in, taking just enough to survive and disappearing back into the earth before dawn. But the trips above ground were dangerous, and Lily knew it. She knew that every time she opened that trap door, she was risking discovery. She knew that Carl was suspicious. She could hear him through the floorboards, asking her mother where Lily had gone, demanding to know if she was hiding somewhere, threatening to tear the house apart board by board until he found her. Her mother's answers were vague, non-committal. She doesn't tell me anything. I don't know where she went. Maybe she ran off. Maybe she's in town. Lily didn't know if her mother was covering for her or genuinely didn't know. She didn't know if her mother had even noticed that the trapdoor in the hillside, buried under 40 years of leaves, had been disturbed. She didn't know anything, except that she was running out of time. The baby grew. That was the other thing she knew, the thing that was impossible to ignore. By December, her belly was round and hard, pressing against the waistband of her jeans, and she could feel the baby moving. Flutters at first, like butterfly wings, and then kicks, real kicks, strong enough to make her gasp. She started to think of the baby as a girl, though she had no way of knowing. She started calling her Rose, after the wild roses that grew along the fence line behind the house, the ones her father used to cut and bring inside for her mother. Rose, her secret, her reason, the thing that kept her crawling through the darkness, kept her rationing her water, kept her lying still when she heard Carl's boots overhead, and every instinct screamed at her to run. By January, Lily was weak. The lack of proper nutrition, the cold that seeped through the earth no matter how many blankets she wrapped herself in, the isolation that ground against her mind like sandpaper. It was all taking a toll. She had lost weight everywhere except her belly. Her hair was falling out in clumps. Her gums bled when she chewed. She knew with the same grim practicality that had kept her alive this long that she was running out of time. The baby was coming. She could feel it in the pressure, the ache, the way her body was shifting and preparing for something it didn't know how to do. She was 17 years old, alone in a hole in the ground, and she was going to give birth without help, without medicine, without anyone to tell her if she was doing it right. She was going to give birth, or she was going to die, and there was no in-between. That was when the trapdoor opened. Lily heard it before she saw it, the creak of hinges that hadn't moved in months, the scrape of wood against wood. She was lying on her side, in the corner of the cellar, wrapped in the quilt, too weak to move quickly, and she watched the light pour in. Gray winter light, dim and cold, but blinding after so many weeks of darkness. And she saw the silhouette of a figure kneeling at the edge of the opening. Her first thought was Carl. Her second thought was that this was it. This was the end, that he had found her, and he would drag her up and do what he'd promised to do. But the voice that spoke wasn't Carl's voice. It was older, thinner, with a rasp like leaves scraping against stone. Lily Dawson. The name was a statement, not a question. I know you're there. The woman's name was Opal Crawford, and she had lived on the property adjacent to the Dawsons for 61 years. She was 83 years old, her spine curved like a question mark, her face a map of lines and creases that told the story of a life spent outdoors in all weather. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis, her eyes clouded with the beginnings of cataracts, but there was nothing wrong with her mind. She remembered when the root cellar was dug. She had been a girl of 12, watching Lily's great-grandfather cut into the hillside with a pickaxe and a determination that bordered on obsession. She remembered when it was used, remembered carrying baskets of potatoes and apples down the ladder to store for winter. And she remembered when it was abandoned, when the family shrank and the land went untended and the cellar door was covered over with leaves and forgotten. But Opal Crawford did not forget things. That was both her gift and her curse. She remembered everything, every face, every conversation, every detail she had ever seen or heard. She remembered Lily as a baby, held in her father's arms at the church picnic in the summer of 1987. She remembered Lily as a child, walking to school along the gravel road with a book bag that was too big for her shoulders. She remembered Lily's father's funeral, remembered seeing the girl standing at the graveside in a dress that didn't fit, her face as blank and empty as the sky. And she had remembered, 3 weeks ago, seeing a flicker of movement behind the Dawson house at 2 o'clock in the morning. A shape that moved like a person, but couldn't be a person, because the only person who moved like that was a girl who had supposedly run away. Opal had watched. She had waited. She had seen the shape emerge from the hillside, slip into the house, and emerge again, carrying a bundle that looked like food. She had watched it disappear back into the earth, into a hole that shouldn't have been there, and she had understood. Come out of there, Opal said, extending her hand into the darkness. "You can't stay down there any longer. I can see that. Whatever you're running from, we'll figure it out. But you've got to come out." She paused, and her voice softened. "Please." Lily didn't move. She couldn't. The light was blinding, and her body was weak, and she didn't know if this woman was salvation or trap, if this was the end of her hiding or the beginning of something worse. But the woman's hand stayed extended, patient, unmoving, and finally Lily reached out and took it. The old woman's grip was stronger than it looked. She pulled Lily upward, out of the cellar, into the light she hadn't seen in 19 weeks. Gray January light, cold and colorless, but light nonetheless. And Lily stood blinking in the winter air, her hand on her belly, tears streaming down her face. She didn't even know she was crying. Opal's cabin was small, 2 rooms plus a kitchen, heated by a wood-burning stove that made the air thick and warm and smelled like pine and smoke. She led Lily inside, sat her down in a chair by the stove, and put a kettle on without a word. The silence between them stretched out, filled with the crackle of the fire and the whistle of wind outside, and Lily waited for the questions to come, the inevitable interrogation about who, what, when, why. But Opal didn't ask. She poured hot water into a mug, added a tea bag and a spoonful of honey, and pressed it into Lily's hands. "Drink," she said, "then eat, then sleep. Questions can wait until you're human again." The first few days were a blur. Lily slept for what felt like years, deep, dreamless sleep that pulled her under like a current and held her there until her body had taken what it needed. Opal fed her soup, toast, scrambled eggs, the simple foods her shrunken stomach could handle. She didn't ask about Carl, didn't ask about the baby, didn't ask about any of it. She simply cared for Lily the way you care for a wounded animal, patiently, quietly, expecting nothing in return. And slowly, as the warmth seeped back into Lily's bones and the food rebuilt her strength, she began to talk. Not because Opal asked, because she needed to, because the words had been trapped inside her for so long that they were pressing against her skin, demanding release. She told Opal everything, about her father, about Carl, about Daniel, about the beating and the threat, and the 19 weeks in the cellar, about the baby. Rose, she called her, and Opal nodded as if the name was obvious, and the terror of bringing her into the world alone. About the moment when the trapdoor opened and she had thought it was all over. About the relief, the impossible relief, of being found by someone who wasn't there to hurt her. Opal listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't comment, didn't offer easy reassurances or platitudes. She just listened, her clouded eyes fixed on Lily's face, her gnarled hands folded in her lap. And when Lily was finished, when the words had run out and the silence filled the cabin again, Opal nodded once and said, "You're not alone anymore. I don't know what's going to happen next, but you're not alone." The baby came 3 weeks later, on a night in February, when the temperature dropped to 8 below and the wind screamed across the hills like something in pain. Lily woke to a feeling she couldn't identify, pressure, tightening, something happening in her body that was beyond her control. She called for Opal, and Opal came, and for the next 14 hours, the 2 women worked together to bring Rose into the world. Opal had delivered babies before, her own, her sister's, her neighbors', in the years when doctors were far away and midwives were all anyone had, and she guided Lily through the contractions, the pushing, the moments when the pain was so overwhelming that Lily was sure she was dying. She held Lily's hand and wiped the sweat from her forehead and told her over and over, "You're doing this. You're almost there. You're almost there." And then, at 4:47 in the morning, with the stove crackling and the wind howling outside, Rose Crawford Dawson was born. 6 pounds, 2 ounces, a full head of dark hair, a cry that filled the cabin and echoed off the walls and sounded to Lily like the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Opal cut the cord with a pair of sewing scissors, wrapped the baby in a blanket she'd been knitting for the past 3 weeks, and placed her in Lily's arms. Lily looked down at the face, Rose's face, Daniel's face, her own face mixed together into something entirely new. And she understood, for the first time, what she had been fighting for. Not just survival. This moment, this life. The weeks that followed were hard in a different way. The hardship of the cellar had been physical: cold, hunger, darkness, isolation. The hardship of new motherhood was something else: exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could touch, the constant weight of another person's needs pressing against her own, the terrifying responsibility of keeping a life going when she barely knew how to keep her own going. But Opal was there. She taught Lily how to nurse, how to change a diaper, how to soothe a crying baby in the middle of the night. She cooked meals and washed clothes and watched Rose while Lily slept. She never complained, never asked for anything in return. When Lily tried to thank her, she waved her hand and said, "This is what we do. This is what people do when they're people." Spring came slowly to the hills, the way it always did. A gradual thawing, a softening of the air, a greening that spread across the landscape like a tide coming in. Lily watched it through Opal's kitchen window, Rose sleeping in a cradle by the stove, and she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been clenched for years, held tight against the possibility of hope, began to loosen. She was still afraid. She was still carrying the weight of everything that had happened: the abuse, the hiding, the 18 weeks in the dark. But she was also alive. Rose was alive. And for the first time since her father died, Lily allowed herself to imagine a future. The reckoning came in June. Lily had known it was coming. You can't disappear from a place without someone eventually noticing. But she had pushed the thought away, focused on the immediate, on getting through each day and each night without thinking about what waited for her on the other side of Opal's property line. But time doesn't stop because you want it to. And one afternoon, while Lily was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin and Rose was sleeping in a basket in the shade of an oak tree, a truck came rumbling up the gravel road, and Lily looked up and saw the county sheriff's department logo on the door, and she knew. The deputy's name was Rebecca Marsh. She was 34 years old, with short brown hair and eyes that had seen too much for her age. She had been investigating a missing persons report, Lily Dawson, age 17, last seen 8 months ago. And she had been working her way through neighbors and relatives and anyone who might have information. She had knocked on Carl Weston's door 3 times. Each time, he had told her the same story. The girl ran off, probably with some boy, good riddance to bad trash. But Deputy Marsh had noticed things. The way Carl's eyes shifted when he talked about Lily. The way Lily's mother flinched every time his voice rose above a certain volume. The bruises on the mother's arms that she always explained away. And so she had kept looking, kept asking questions, kept following the thread until it led her here, to an old woman's cabin on the edge of the property, to a girl with a baby in her arms who was supposed to be missing. Lily didn't run. There was nowhere to run to, and she was tired of running, and she had a daughter now who deserved better than a mother who spent her life hiding. So she stood by the laundry line, Rose in her arms, and she told the truth. All of it. The abuse, the pregnancy, the beating, the threat, the 19 weeks underground. She told it in a flat, steady voice, the way you tell a story that happened to someone else, because that was the only way she could get through it without breaking. And Deputy Marsh listened, the way Opal had listened, without interruption, without judgment, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes growing darker and harder with every word. When Lily finished, Deputy Marsh was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I need you to come with me. Not to arrest you, to make a statement. And then we're going to pay a visit to your stepfather, and he's going to answer some questions he's been avoiding for a long time." The trial lasted 4 days. Carl Weston was charged with domestic assault, child endangerment, and criminal threatening. Lily testified. Her mother testified, haltingly, tearfully, a woman finally breaking free from the fear that had held her captive for 6 years. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Carl was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary. When the verdict was read, he didn't react. He just stared at Lily with those flat blue eyes, the eyes that had haunted her nightmares for years, and she stared back. She didn't flinch, she didn't look away, and somewhere in that exchange, something shifted. The power he had held over her for so long, the fear, the control, the constant threat of violence, crumbled like a house built on sand. He was just a man, a weak, cruel man who had been afraid of a teenage girl and her unborn baby. And now, he was going to prison, and she was free. Her mother tried to rebuild their relationship in the years that followed. It was awkward, painful, two people who had been through too much together trying to find their way back to each other across a distance that seemed impossible to cross. Her mother moved out of the house. She couldn't stand to be there anymore, couldn't stand the walls that held so many memories of fear and failure, and rented an apartment in town. She got a job at the grocery store, started attending support groups for survivors of domestic violence, started slowly, painfully, becoming the woman she might have been if Carl had never walked into that hardware store. She and Lily talked on the phone every week. They saw each other twice a month, always at Opal's cabin, never at the old house that still sat empty at the end of rural Route 7. The conversations were careful, measured, two people learning to trust each other again after trust had been so thoroughly broken. But they were trying. Both of them were trying. And that, Lily told herself, had to count for something. Rose grew. That was the miracle that sustained everything else. The way a baby becomes a toddler becomes a child, the way each day brings something new, something worth being alive for. Her first word was more. Appropriate, Opal said with a dry laugh, for a girl who had come into the world wanting. Her first steps were taken in Opal's kitchen, a wobbly journey from the table to the stove, where a pot of soup was simmering and the air smelled like home. She was curious, determined, stubbornly independent in a way that reminded Lily of herself at that age, before Carl, before fear, before she had learned to shrink herself down to survive. She wanted Rose to never learn that lesson. She wanted Rose to grow up loud and demanding and unafraid, to take up all the space she needed, to never feel like she had to become invisible to be safe. Opal passed away on a Thursday morning in October, 4 years after she had pulled Lily out of the cellar. She was 87 years old. Her heart, the doctor said, had simply decided it was done. Lily was with her when it happened, sitting beside her bed in the cabin, holding her hand the way Opal had held hers during Rose's birth. Opal's last words were not profound. She asked if someone had fed the chickens, but they were perfectly her, practical and unsentimental to the end. Lily cried for 3 days. She cried the way the creek ran after a heavy rain, fully and loudly, letting the grief move through her without trying to hold it back. And then she got up, and she took care of the chickens, and she started figuring out how to live in a world without the woman who had saved her life. Opal had left everything to Lily in her will: the cabin, the land, the few $1,000s she had saved over a lifetime of frugal living. It wasn't much by most standards, but to Lily, who had once had nothing but a hole in the ground and a jar of peanut butter, it was a fortune. She and Rose stayed in the cabin. Lily got her GED, then enrolled in community college, taking classes at night while Rose slept in the next room. She studied nursing, a practical choice, a skill that would always be needed. And she was good at it, better than she'd been at anything in school. She graduated with honors. She got a job at the hospital in town, working the overnight shifts so she could be home with Rose during the day. It was hard. It was exhausting. It was also a life, a real life, built with her own hands, belonging entirely to her. She found Daniel again when Rose was 6 years old, not through effort or searching, but through the strange coincidences that life sometimes arranges. He walked into the emergency room one night with a broken wrist, a work injury. He was a mechanic now, just like his father. And he looked up at the nurse who was taking his vitals, and he froze. Lily. He said her name like he wasn't sure he believed it, like she might be a ghost or a dream. They stood there for a long moment, 6 years of silence stretched between them, and then Lily said, "You should see our daughter. She has your nose." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. They sat in the hospital cafeteria, drinking bad coffee from styrofoam cups, and Lily told him everything: the pregnancy, the cellar, Opal, the trial, the years she had spent rebuilding herself from the ground up. Daniel listened the way everyone in this story listened, fully, without interruption. And when she was done, he put his hand on hers and said, "I should have come back. I should have found you. I'm sorry." And Lily, who had spent years not blaming him for something that wasn't his fault, shook her head and said, "You didn't know. There was nothing you could have done. But you're here now. That's what matters." They didn't fall in love again immediately. You can't pick up a relationship after 6 years as if nothing happened, as if you're both the same people you were at 16 and 17. They started slow, dinners, phone calls, carefully chaperoned visits, where Daniel got to know the daughter he had never known existed. Rose was suspicious at first, the way children are suspicious of anything that disrupts their world. But Daniel was patient. He played with her. He read her stories. He showed up week after week, month after month, until eventually she stopped asking when he was leaving and started asking when he was coming back. By the time Rose was 8, Daniel had moved into the cabin. By the time she was 10, Lily and Daniel were married. A small ceremony in Opal's backyard, surrounded by the roses that Lily had planted in her memory, with Rose serving as flower girl and ring bearer simultaneously because she refused to choose just one role. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Lily still had nightmares. She still flinched at unexpected sounds. She still carried the weight of those 19 weeks in the cellar, the weight of a childhood spent invisible, the weight of everything she had survived. But she also had a daughter who loved her, a husband who saw her, a home that was her own. She had a life, and that, she had learned, was enough. The old house on rural Route 7 was eventually torn down. Lily bought the property with savings from 15 years of nursing, knocked down the walls that had witnessed so much pain, and planted a garden where the living room used to be. The root cellar was filled in with earth and gravel, sealed over with concrete, and in the spring, when the ground softened enough to dig, Lily planted a rose bush on top of it. A wild rose, the same kind her father used to cut for her mother, the same kind that grew along the fence line where she had played as a child. She told Rose, her daughter, 18 years old now and preparing to leave for college, about the cellar. She told her everything, not to burden her or to make her carry the weight of her mother's history, but because secrets are like seeds. Left buried, they grow in the dark, becoming something twisted and dangerous. Brought into the light, they can be transformed. Rose listened. She asked questions, hard questions, the kind only a child who loves you enough to push can ask. She wanted to know how Lily had survived. She wanted to know if she was still afraid. She wanted to know if Lily had forgiven her mother, her grandmother, the system that had failed her, the man who had tried to destroy her. And Lily answered as honestly as she could, "I survived because I had you. Because even when I didn't want to live for myself, I wanted to live for you. I'm still afraid sometimes. Fear doesn't go away just because the thing you were afraid of is over. It lives in your body, in your bones. But I don't let it control me anymore. I feel it and I do things anyway." Forgiveness. Lily paused, thinking about the question the way she had thought about it for years. Forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was okay. It's about deciding not to carry the weight anymore. I've forgiven your grandmother because holding on to anger was hurting me more than it was hurting her. I've forgiven the people who didn't see what was happening because they were broken too, in their own ways. Carl? She shook her head. I don't forgive him. Maybe I never will. But I've let go of him. He doesn't live in my head anymore. He doesn't get to take up space in my life. And that's enough. That's the best I can do. Rose was quiet for a long time after that conversation. She was a thoughtful girl, woman now, really, though Lily still saw the baby she had held in Opal's cabin, the child who had taken her first steps across a kitchen floor, the stubborn, determined person she had been raising for 18 years. Finally, Rose looked at her mother and said, "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for being my mom." Lily pulled her daughter into her arms, the way she had held her on the night she was born, and she felt something settle into place inside her. Not peace exactly, not the absence of pain. Something more fundamental than either. The knowledge that she had done what she set out to do all those years ago in the cellar. She had kept her daughter safe. She had given her everything. She had broken the cycle that could have broken them both. The rose bush grew. It grew the way wild things grow, untamed, resilient, refusing to be stopped by rocky soil or harsh winters, or the violence that had happened in the ground beneath it. Every spring it bloomed, pink and white and red flowers, fragrant and stubborn and beautiful, covering the place where a teenage girl had once hidden in the dark and talked to her unborn daughter about the world outside. Lily would stand by the bush sometimes, in the early mornings when the light was soft and the air smelled like rain. and she would think about the girl she had been. 16 years old, terrified, alone. She wanted to reach back through time and tell that girl what she knew now, that she would survive, that she would build something beautiful from the ruins, that the darkness would not last forever. But she couldn't reach back. No one can. The only direction is forward. So Lily did what she had always done. She got up in the morning, she kissed her husband goodbye, she called her daughter, away at college now, living a life that Lily could never have imagined for herself at that age. She visited her mother, who was 72 years old, and finally, learning how to be the person she might have been. She went to work at the hospital, caring for strangers the way Opal had cared for her, offering kindness without expectation of return. She tended the rose bush, the garden, the land that had been passed down through 4 generations of her family. She lived. If you're watching this right now, and you're in a dark place, maybe a place darker than anything you ever imagined you'd have to survive, I want you to take something from this story. Not that everything will work out perfectly. It won't. Lily still has scars. She still has nightmares. She still carries the weight of what happened to her, even though she's learned to carry it differently. But she's here. She made it through. And so can you. The cellar wasn't the end of her story. The abuse wasn't the end. The moment when everything seemed impossible and hopeless and too hard to bear, that wasn't the end either. There was something on the other side. There's always something on the other side, even when you can't see it, even when every voice inside your head is telling you to give up. So don't give up. Hold on. Reach out. Let someone find you. Let someone help. And when you finally climb out of the darkness, when you finally stand in the light and feel the sun on your face and the air in your lungs, remember. Remember what you survived. Remember what it taught you. Remember that you are stronger than the thing that tried to destroy you, and that strength will carry you forward, one day at a time, one step at a time, into a life worth living.